it's Colleen and I have one more book for today. This one is called Mr. Seahorse by Carle. Let's see. This book also has windows in it, like the book that I read about the panda. You'll see them in a minute. Here we go. Mr. Seahorse by Carle. Mr. and Mrs. Seahorse drifted gently through the sea. Mrs. Seahorse began to wiggle and twist this way and that. She's wiggling. It's time for me to lay my eggs, she said. Can I help? Asked Mr. Seahorse. Oh, yes. Thank you, said Mrs. Seahorse. And she laid her eggs into a pouch on Mr. Seahorse's belly. She's putting her eggs in Mr. Seahorse's belly. I'll take good care of our eggs, said Mr. Seahorse. I promise. As Mr. Seahorse drifted gently through the sea, he has the eggs in his belly. He passed right by a group of trumpet fish hidden in a patch of reeds. Here's the reeds. You see it's a window. And there are the trumpet fish. And now Mr. Seahorse is behind the reeds. But before long, Mr. Seahorse met another fish. How are you, Mr. Stickleback? Asked Mr. Seahorse. Delighted, replied Mr. Stickleback. I just built a nest, and right away Mrs. Stickleback laid her eggs into it. Now I am taking good care of them until they hatch. Keep up the good work, said Mr. Seahorse, and swam on his way. So the stickleback fish lays their eggs in a nest. As Mr. Seahorse drifted gently through the sea, he passed right by. Can you see what's hiding in there? Can you see what it is? Can you see through the window? See right there, there's something hiding. Do you want to see what it is? A lionfish hidden behind a coral reef. And now Mr. Seahorse is hiding behind the coral reef. But before long, Mr. Seahorse met another fish. How are you, Mr. Tilapia? Asked Mr. Seahorse. Mr. Tilapia couldn't answer. His mouth was full of eggs. I know, said Mr. Seahorse. Mrs. Tilapia laid her eggs. Now you are taking good care of them until they hatch. Mr. Tilapia nodded his head. You must be very happy, said Mr. Seahorse, and swam on his way. So this daddy fish is keeping the egg safe in his mouth. That's unusual. I didn't know fish did that. As Mr. Seahorse drifted gently through the sea, he passed right by. Let's make sure there's not a glare. Can you see what's hiding in the seaweed? Can you see it? I think there's two of them. Let's see what it is. A pair of leaf fish hidden among the seaweed. And now look who's hiding in the seaweed. Mr. Seahorse. But before long, Mr. Seahorse met another fish. How are you, Mr. Curtis? He asked Mr. Seahorse. Perfectly fine, replied Mr. Curtis. Mrs. Curtis laid her eggs, and I have them stuck to my head. Now I am taking good care of them until they hatch. You are doing a good job, said Mr. Seahorse, and swam away. So this daddy fish keeps the eggs safe on his head. All these creatures in the sea are keeping the eggs, they have the babies in them, they're keeping them safe in different ways. As Mr. Seahorse drifted gently through the sea, he passed right by, Can you see what's hiding behind the rock? Can you see it? Let's see what's behind the rock. A stonefish hiding behind a rock. And now look who's behind the rock. Mr. Seahorse. But before long, Mr. Seahorse met another fish. How are you, Mr. Pipe? Asked Mr. Seahorse. Couldn't be better, replied Mr. Pipe. Mrs. Pipe laid her eggs along my belly. Now I am taking good care of them until they hatch. Do you see all these little circles? Those are the eggs that he's keeping safe. You should feel proud of yourself, said Mr. Seahorse, and swam on his way. But before long, Mr. Seahorse met another fish. How are you, Mr. Bullhead? Asked Mr. Seahorse. Tip-top, replied Mr. Bullhead. Mrs. Bullhead laid her eggs, and the eggs hatched. Now I'm watching my babies. You are doing a fine job, said Mr. Seahorse, and swam on his way. So these fish were in little tiny eggs, and then they hatched. And now they're fish swimming around. The time had come for the seahorses to be born. Mr. Seahorse wiggled and twisted this way and that way. At last, the babies tumbled from Mr. Seahorse's pouch. This is the pouch where the eggs were. They tumbled from Mr. Seahorse's pouch and swam away. One baby turned around and tried to go back into the pouch. Oh no, said Mr. Seahorse. I do love you, but you are ready to be on your own. See, that one turned around and wants to go back in. And he said, no, it's time for you to swim around now. So now they're not eggs anymore. They hatched into little baby seahorses. Isn't that cool? That is the end of Mr. Seahorse.